I came home from a short trip expecting quiet, familiar comfort. Instead, my key slid into the lock and refused to turn. Through the front window, I could see it immediately. Every piece of furniture gone, every room stripped bare. My daughter had changed the locks on my $3 million house while I was away. For a moment, I stood there on the porch, staring at the door that used to welcome me home. Most people would panic. Some would cry. But as I looked at that new lock, I realized something they didn't know. This was not the beginning of their victory. It was the moment their plan started collapsing. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitaker. I am 67 years old, a widow, and until a few years ago, I spent most of my adult life working as a forensic financial investigator for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. For more than 3 decades, my job was to follow money that people thought could not be traced. I investigated fraud schemes, hidden partnerships, and complicated paper trails that were designed to confuse regulators and protect people who believed they were clever enough to stay one step ahead of the law. That career taught me 2 things that never left me. Numbers rarely lie, and patterns always tell a story if you watch closely enough. After I retired, I returned to the house that had anchored my life for nearly 30 years. The home sits in the Battery District of Charleston, South Carolina, where the streets are lined with historic houses facing the harbor. Our home is a 3-story structure built in the late 19th century, with tall windows that catch the morning sun and wide porches that wrap around the front like open arms. Magnolia trees stand along the property line, and in the evenings the air carries the quiet sound of boats moving across Charleston Harbor. Real estate agents now say the property is worth close to $3 million, but to me, it has never felt like an investment. It has always felt like memory. My husband, Thomas Whitaker, and I bought the house when our daughter was still a child. Thomas was a federal judge, respected in the Charleston legal community, and he believed that a house should be more than walls and rooms. He used to say that a real home grows alongside the people living inside it. Over the years, the floors absorbed the sound of family dinners, late-night conversations, and birthday parties that stretched long into summer evenings. When Thomas died suddenly of a heart attack 6 years ago, the house became quieter in a way that is difficult to describe. Every room still held his presence, but the silence felt heavier than it once had. Our daughter, Olivia Whitaker, is 39 now and works as a real estate attorney here in Charleston. She grew up in this house, doing homework at the dining room table and racing down the hallway stairs on Saturday mornings. For most of her life, I believed she would one day inherit the house and continue the story that Thomas and I had started. Several years ago, Olivia married Ryan Keller. Ryan works in real estate investment and development, a profession that Charleston seems to produce endlessly these days. The first time he visited our home, he arrived with an easy smile and the kind of confident handshake that successful businessmen practice. At first, I liked him. He spoke smoothly about property markets and development opportunities, and he seemed eager to become part of our family. But over time, I began to notice something I could not quite explain. Whenever Ryan visited, his attention drifted toward the house itself. He studied the architecture, the size of the lot, the view of the harbor. Then the questions began. He asked about the property taxes, the cost of maintenance, and the amount of insurance coverage the house carried. Each question was polite and reasonable by itself. Still, together they formed a pattern that felt strangely familiar. 35 years of investigating financial crimes has a way of sharpening your instincts. Experienced investigators rarely rely on a single suspicious detail. Instead, they watch quietly and wait for patterns to emerge. I told myself not to read too much into Ryan's curiosity. After all, he was part of the family now. Yet one evening, as I stood alone on the front veranda watching the sun sink behind Charleston Harbor, a thought settled in the back of my mind and refused to leave. Sometimes the most dangerous schemes do not begin with strangers. Sometimes they begin at your own dinner table. If you're still watching and this moment caught your attention, comment number 1 below, so I know you're with me. Because what happened next was not just about a locked door. It was the first sign that something far more calculated had been happening behind my back. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. Several weeks after that quiet evening on the veranda, Olivia and Ryan came to dinner again. Autumn had settled comfortably over Charleston, and the evening air carried the faint smell of salt drifting from the harbor. I spent the afternoon cooking a simple meal, the kind of dinner that had once been routine when Olivia still lived at home. Preparing it felt almost nostalgic. Roasted vegetables filled the kitchen with warmth, and the windows were open just enough to let the breeze move gently through the house. When Olivia and Ryan arrived, everything appeared normal. Olivia hugged me in the hallway and complimented the way the house smelled. Ryan followed behind her with his usual relaxed smile, looking as confident as ever. We sat together at the dining room table that had been part of our family life for nearly 3 decades. At first, the conversation moved easily. Olivia talked about a complicated real estate dispute she had been handling at her law firm. Ryan spoke about the rapid growth of property development around Charleston and how historic homes had become some of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the city. I listened quietly while we ate, enjoying the calm rhythm of a familiar evening. Gradually, however, the conversation began circling back toward the house itself. Ryan mentioned how rare it had become for historic properties near the harbor to remain privately owned by families instead of investors. He spoke about recent sales in the Battery District and how prices had increased dramatically over the past few years. Then he made a comment that changed the atmosphere in the room. He said that maintaining a house this large must be difficult for someone my age. His voice carried a tone that sounded almost concerned, as if he were offering practical advice. He talked about maintenance costs, security systems, and the responsibilities that came with managing an older property. I kept my expression calm while he spoke. I had spent too many years watching people hide their intentions behind polite conversation to react too quickly. Olivia surprised me by agreeing with him. She suggested that living alone in such a large house might eventually become overwhelming. Her words were gentle, but something about the way she avoided meeting my eyes unsettled me. I changed the subject without confronting either of them. Experience had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe no one is paying close attention. The conversation drifted to other topics, and the evening ended without any argument or tension. After they left, the house returned to its familiar silence. I walked slowly through the rooms, turning off lights and straightening small things along the way. The dining room still carried the smell of dinner. In the hallway, I paused beside a framed photograph of Olivia as a child standing on the front steps with Thomas beside her. The house had always been more than property. It held pieces of our history. Later that night, I sat in the study and opened my laptop. Old habits are difficult to abandon, even after retirement. I logged into my banking accounts and reviewed recent access records. Most entries were routine, but a few attempts came from devices I did not recognize. No money had been moved, and the attempts were brief, almost like someone testing whether the accounts could be reached. The discovery did not frighten me. Instead, it sharpened my attention. In financial investigations, early access attempts often appear before larger actions. People who intend to move money usually begin by studying the systems that protect it. I quietly began backing up important documents, property deeds, insurance policies, retirement records, and estate planning files were copied into a secure digital archive that only I controlled. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a financial fraud conference in Denver, Colorado. The event would last several days, and I decided to stay longer afterward for a short personal break. The trip would take me away from Charleston for nearly 2 weeks. As I packed my suitcase one evening, I paused at the bedroom window overlooking the harbor. The lights of distant boats moved slowly across the dark water. For a moment, I considered asking Olivia to check on the house while I was gone. The thought passed quickly. Instead, I arranged for a neighbor to keep an eye on the property. When I locked the front door the morning I left for the airport, the house stood quiet behind me. At that time, I still believed I was simply following old professional instincts. I had no idea that the real test of those instincts was about to begin. If you're still here, and this story is starting to make you curious, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. Because the strange changes I noticed were only the beginning, and the next discovery made me realize someone very close to me might already be planning something dangerous. Now, let's move on to Chapter 3. 2 weeks later, my flight from Denver landed in Charleston just after noon. The conference had gone well, and the extra days I spent walking through quiet streets and unfamiliar neighborhoods had helped clear my thoughts. For a short time, I allowed myself to believe that the uneasy feeling I carried before leaving Charleston might have been nothing more than habit. When you spend 35 years investigating financial fraud, suspicion becomes part of the way you see the world. Driving back toward the Battery District felt like returning to something steady and familiar. The narrow streets were shaded by old trees, and the harbor breeze carried the scent of salt through the neighborhood. Everything looked exactly the same as when I had left, until I pulled into my driveway. At first, the difference was subtle. The front door looked slightly brighter than I remembered, as though the brass lock had been polished. I walked up the front steps with my suitcase still in my hand and reached for my key. The key slid into the lock easily, but when I turned it, nothing happened. I paused, assuming the key might not be aligned properly. I removed it and tried again more carefully. The metal turned slightly before stopping with a dull resistance. That was when I noticed the lock itself. The brass was new, too clean, too smooth. The lock that had been on this door for years carried small scratches and marks from decades of use. This one had none of that. Someone had replaced it. I walked around the side of the house and tried the side entrance. The same thing happened. The lock had been changed there as well. For several seconds I stood there in silence, looking at the door of the house I had lived in for nearly 30 years. Then I moved back toward the front windows. The curtains were not positioned the way I had left them. I pressed my hand against the glass and leaned slightly closer, trying to see inside. The living room looked wrong. It took a moment for my mind to understand what my eyes were seeing. The sofa that had sat beneath the window for years was gone. The reading chair Thomas used every evening had disappeared. The side table beside the bookshelf was missing as well. The room looked empty. A hollow feeling settled in my chest, not panic exactly, but something heavier. I stepped back from the window and sat slowly on the front steps. My suitcase rested beside me while the quiet street continued its ordinary afternoon routine. Across the road, my neighbor was watering plants near the sidewalk. I took out my phone and called Olivia. She answered quickly. Her voice sounded calm, almost practiced. I asked why the locks on my house had been replaced. There was a brief pause before she explained that the situation had been handled while I was away. She said the decision had been made because living alone in such a large house was not safe anymore. According to her, new arrangements had already been put in place. The explanation ended as quickly as it began. When the call disconnected, I remained sitting on the steps, staring at the front door. A few minutes later, my neighbor walked over and mentioned seeing a moving truck parked outside the previous afternoon. She remembered watching several workers carry furniture out while Olivia and Ryan stood nearby giving instructions. The last pieces of uncertainty fell into place. My daughter and her husband had emptied my house while I was out of town. I looked down at my phone again. Instead of anger, a strange calm settled over me. Before leaving Charleston, I had prepared for possibilities that most people never imagine. Quietly, I opened the security application connected to the hidden cameras inside the house. The archived footage from the past 2 days began to load, and for the first time since arriving home, I realized I was about to see exactly what had happened behind my locked door. If you're still watching and wondering how this situation could get worse, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still with me. Because the moment I looked deeper into what had been happening while I was away, I uncovered a truth that changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. Now, let's move on to Chapter 4. I remained seated on the front steps of my own house while the security application finished loading on my phone. The afternoon sun hung quietly over the Battery District, casting long shadows across the street. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested anything unusual had happened. A bicycle passed slowly along the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, yet I was sitting outside a home that I could not enter. When the first video file appeared on my screen, I opened it without hesitation. The camera angle came from the living room smoke detector, positioned high enough to capture most of the room. The timestamp showed it had been recorded the previous afternoon while I was still in Denver. The front door opened. Ryan Keller walked inside. He did not move like someone who was uncertain or nervous. He stepped into the house with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had every right to be there. Behind him came 2 movers wearing work uniforms. They carried empty boxes and began looking around the room while Ryan pointed toward the furniture. Within minutes, the process of emptying my living room began. The sofa beneath the window disappeared first. Then the 2 leather chairs Thomas and I had bought years earlier were lifted and carried through the doorway. The side table beside the bookshelf followed, along with the framed photographs that had once rested on its surface. I continued watching as the movers worked steadily through the room. Ryan supervised the entire operation. Occasionally he checked his phone or glanced toward the hallway, but there was no hesitation in his actions. The footage showed a man executing a plan he believed was already secure. I opened another video clip. This one came from the camera hidden in the hallway. Several boxes of personal belongings were stacked along the wall, while the movers carried artwork out of the dining room. A few minutes later, Olivia entered through the front door. Her posture was noticeably different from Ryan's. She walked slowly through the hallway, looking around the house as if something about the situation unsettled her. I watched her pause beside the staircase and looked toward the empty living room. Ryan approached her and spoke quietly. From the camera's position, the words were not clear, but his gestures were confident and reassuring. Olivia eventually nodded, though the hesitation in her expression remained. I opened the next recording. This one showed my study. Ryan walked directly to the desk where I had worked for years managing financial records and personal documents. He opened several drawers, moving through the files with surprising familiarity. After a moment, he removed a folder labeled estate planning. He sat down in my chair. Ryan studied the document for several seconds before picking up a pen. Then he signed the paper with my name. Even through the video recording, I could see the difference immediately. The movement of the pen was wrong. The spacing of the letters was uneven. It was not my signature. I paused the video and lowered the phone for a moment. 35 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me how quickly a situation can move from suspicion to proof. What I had just witnessed was not simply a family disagreement about property. It was forgery. Months earlier, I had quietly transferred the legal ownership of the house into an irrevocable trust managed by my attorney. That decision had been a precaution I hoped I would never need. Now it meant that Ryan's forged document would accomplish nothing. I resumed the video long enough to save several critical clips and upload them to the secure archive connected to my attorney. Ryan believed he had taken control of my house while I was away. What he did not realize was that every step he took inside those walls had already been recorded. And evidence, when preserved carefully, has a way of rewriting other people's plans. If you're still here and the story has you hooked, comment number 4 below so I know you're still following, because what I decided to do next was something they never expected, and it would turn their entire plan against them. Now, let's continue to Chapter 5. I remained on the front steps long after the first group of video files had finished playing. The quiet Charleston afternoon continued around me as if nothing had changed. Cars moved slowly along the street. The wind stirred the branches of the magnolia trees. Yet inside my mind, the pieces of Ryan Keller's plan were beginning to arrange themselves into something far more deliberate than simple theft. I reopened the security application and continued reviewing the archived footage. The system had recorded activity in nearly every room of the house during the previous afternoon. Each clip showed another part of the operation unfolding with unsettling efficiency. Movers carried furniture through the front door in steady rhythm. Boxes containing books, photographs, and personal belongings were stacked near the entrance before being taken outside. Ryan moved constantly between rooms. He appeared entirely comfortable inside the house, as if the outcome had already been decided and he was simply completing the final steps. Several times, he stopped to make phone calls. From the way he spoke and the relaxed pace of his movements, it was clear he did not expect any interruption. One recording captured him standing alone in the study beside my desk. The camera angle allowed only fragments of his conversation to be heard, but it was enough to understand the subject. He spoke about paperwork being filed and about ownership transferring once documents were processed. The confidence in his voice suggested he believed the legal outcome was inevitable. I watched the clip twice before closing it. Then I opened another camera angle, this one from the dining room. Olivia appeared in the doorway several minutes later. She held a folder in her hands and walked slowly toward the table. Her posture lacked the certainty Ryan displayed throughout the recordings. She examined several pages inside the folder while Ryan stood beside her explaining something. Even without hearing every word, I could see hesitation in her movements. She studied the documents carefully before finally signing one of the pages. The action looked reluctant rather than enthusiastic. When she finished, Ryan collected the paperwork and placed it back into the folder with visible satisfaction. That moment told me something important. Olivia was involved, but she did not appear to understand the full structure of what Ryan was doing. I locked my phone screen for a moment and considered the broader pattern. Ryan had spent months asking about the value of the house, the taxes, and the insurance coverage. At the time, his curiosity had seemed excessive but harmless. Now, those questions formed the outline of a financial strategy. I reopened my banking and monitoring applications and began checking recent alerts connected to my financial accounts. Several access attempts had already appeared during the weeks before my trip. The system also showed recent inquiries involving my insurance records. One notification immediately caught my attention. An unfamiliar policy number had been linked to my name. I opened the document and read the details slowly. The policy was a recently issued life insurance contract with the coverage far larger than any policy I had ever purchased. My name appeared as the insured individual. The beneficiary listed on the form was Olivia Whitaker. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Stealing the house would have been a serious crime by itself, but the existence of a life insurance policy suggested something far more dangerous. Ryan Keller had not only planned to take my property, he had been preparing for a future in which my death would become financially valuable. The sky over Charleston had begun to dim by the time I finally stood up from the steps of my house. The street was quieter now. The carriage tours had disappeared, and the afternoon traffic had thinned into the slow evening rhythm the Battery District usually settled into after sunset. For several minutes, I remained standing in the driveway, looking at the house that Ryan believed he had taken from me. The truth was simple. I could call the police immediately. The evidence already existed. The camera recordings clearly showed Ryan hiring a locksmith, replacing the locks, and directing the removal of furniture from the house. Any officer reviewing that footage would recognize unlawful entry and theft. But after 35 years investigating financial crimes, I had learned something that younger investigators often ignored. Timing matters. If I reported everything now, Ryan could still attempt to disguise his actions as confusion within a family. He might claim Olivia had permission to manage the property or that I had approved temporary changes while traveling. People involved in fraud frequently rely on ambiguity to protect themselves. What I needed was something stronger. I needed proof that Ryan understood exactly what he was doing. So instead of calling the police, I opened my car door and drove away from the house. A few miles inland, my longtime friend Eleanor Hayes lived in another quiet neighborhood of Charleston. Eleanor and I had known each other for nearly 20 years, long enough that explanations were rarely necessary. When she opened the door that evening, she immediately sensed something unusual. I told her only that a serious property issue had occurred and that I might need to stay for a short while. Eleanor simply nodded and led me into her living room without asking further questions. Within minutes, I had my laptop open on the coffee table. The security camera system allowed me to view live feeds from every room in my house. Each camera continued recording and uploading footage to the secure storage server. For several hours, nothing happened. The empty rooms of the house appeared strange without the furniture that had once filled them. Shadows from the streetlights moved slowly across the wooden floors. Then, just after 9 o'clock, the front door opened. Ryan stepped inside. I leaned slightly closer to the screen while watching him move through the living room. His expression looked focused, almost impatient. He walked directly toward the study without even glancing at the other rooms. Moments later, he sat down at my desk and opened his laptop. The camera angle did not reveal the screen, but I already knew what he was checking. I opened the Charleston County Property Records website on my own computer and searched the property address again. The filing appeared exactly where I expected, pending verification. Ryan remained seated in the study for nearly 15 minutes, typing occasionally and refreshing the page on his computer. The property transfer he had submitted earlier that afternoon still had not processed. What he did not know was that the system would never approve it. The house no longer legally belonged to me. Weeks earlier, it had been placed into an irrevocable trust managed by my attorney. Any document submitted without the trustee's authorization would automatically fail verification. Ryan shifted in his chair and closed the laptop with visible frustration. For me, that moment confirmed something far more valuable than anger. It confirmed intent. He knew exactly what he was doing. I began organizing the evidence: video recordings, screenshots of the property filing, financial records showing Ryan's enormous debt. One by one, the files moved into a secure digital folder. When everything was finished, I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Ryan believed he was hours away from owning my house. In reality, he had spent the entire evening strengthening the case that would soon end his freedom. If you're still watching and want to see how far this situation really goes, comment number 6 below so I know you're still with me. Because what the investigation uncovered next revealed that the house was never the only thing at stake. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. I woke early the next morning in Eleanor Hayes' guest room, long before the sun had fully risen over Charleston. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic beginning to move through the city. I had slept only a few hours, yet I felt unusually calm. For most people, a situation like this would have brought panic. For me, it brought clarity. Once evidence is gathered, the rest of the process becomes methodical. That was something my career had taught me again and again. I carried my laptop into Eleanor's kitchen and opened the digital folder I had assembled the night before. The files inside represented every step Ryan had taken during the previous day. Video recordings showed him speaking with the locksmith, replacing the locks, and walking through the house while directing the movers. Another recording clearly captured him sitting in my study forging my signature on a property document. Alongside the videos were screenshots of the Charleston County Property Registration website showing the pending transfer request he had submitted. Finally, there were the financial records I had uncovered weeks earlier. Ryan Keller's failed cryptocurrency investment had left him buried under nearly $900,000 in debt. Together, the files told a story that no explanation could easily erase. I sent the entire evidence package to my attorney shortly after 7 that morning. Within 20 minutes, a reply appeared in my inbox, confirming what I already suspected. The evidence was strong enough to support both criminal charges and civil claims. The next step was simple. I drove back toward the Battery District. Morning light had begun to wash across Charleston Harbor by the time I reached my street. The neighborhood looked as peaceful as ever. Old houses stood quietly behind their iron fences, and the sidewalks were empty except for a few early walkers. My house stood exactly where it always had, unchanged from the day before. But now it felt different. This was no longer just my home. It had become the center of an investigation. I parked along the curb and called the Charleston Police Department. Within half an hour, 2 officers arrived and stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the house. I explained what had happened in calm, steady detail. Then I showed them the video footage stored on my phone. The reaction was immediate. Both officers watched the recordings in silence as Ryan appeared on the screen speaking with the locksmith and later directing the moving crew. The images left little room for interpretation. One officer contacted the department's Financial Crimes Division, while the other began documenting the scene. A short time later, another patrol unit located the moving company Ryan had hired. The workers explained that they had been paid in cash and were told the property owner had moved to assisted living. They believed they were simply transporting furniture for a family member. The furniture, they reported, was currently stored at a temporary warehouse used by their company. Police arranged to secure the items as evidence. Later that morning, the officers informed me that they had located Ryan at his business office. When questioned about the property, he initially attempted to claim the situation was a family decision and that I had approved the transfer before leaving Charleston. But the officers already had the footage. His explanation did not last long. They also spoke with Olivia. According to the officers, she appeared shocked by what they showed her. She insisted Ryan had told her the arrangements were legitimate and that I had agreed to everything. Standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, I listened quietly as the officers finished documenting the report. Ryan believed he had taken control of a $3 million property. Instead, he had started something far more serious. The investigation had only begun. By the time I returned to Eleanor Hayes' house that afternoon, the investigation had already begun moving in directions I expected. Years of working with financial crime cases had taught me that once law enforcement obtained clear evidence, events tended to move quickly. Still, there is a strange quiet that settles in after the first wave of action passes. Eleanor gave me the living room to work in while she went about her day, respecting the silence that seemed necessary. I sat with my laptop open on the coffee table, occasionally reviewing the files I had already sent to my attorney and the police. The evidence had left little room for confusion. Late that afternoon, My phone rang. The number belonged to the Charleston Police Department. The detective assigned to the case introduced himself and explained that Ryan Keller had been brought in for questioning earlier that day. According to the detective, Ryan began with the same explanation he had offered the patrol officers. He claimed that the changes to the house were part of a family decision and that I had approved the arrangements before leaving Charleston. That explanation did not last long. The detectives presented him with the security footage taken from inside my house. The recordings clearly showed him instructing the locksmith, directing the movers, and later sitting in my study writing on the property transfer document. After that point, the conversation changed. The detective then explained that investigators had begun examining Ryan's financial background. Public records confirmed what I had already discovered weeks earlier. Ryan had invested heavily in a cryptocurrency venture that collapsed earlier that year. The failure left him responsible for nearly $900,000 in debt. Creditors had already begun pursuing legal action against him. The attempted property transfer suddenly made far more sense, but the detective had not called simply to confirm financial trouble. While examining Ryan's computer records and online financial activity, investigators discovered something far more troubling. Several weeks earlier, Ryan had submitted an application for a life insurance policy valued at approximately $3.5 million. The insured individual listed on the policy was me. The beneficiary listed was Olivia. I felt a quiet stillness move through my chest as the detective explained the details. I had never applied for such a policy. The application contained a digital signature that attempted to replicate my own handwriting. It was another forgery. The implication did not need to be explained. If Ryan had succeeded in transferring the house, the debt problem might have been solved. If that plan failed, the insurance policy offered another possibility. The detective assured me that Olivia appeared unaware of the policy when investigators spoke with her. According to him, she seemed genuinely shocked when they showed her the documents. That detail stayed with me long after the call ended. Betrayal inside a family rarely arrives in simple forms. Ryan's intentions now appeared increasingly calculated, but Olivia's role remained less clear. That evening, I sat quietly in Eleanor's living room, watching the light fade through the windows. Ryan believed stealing my house would solve his problems. Instead, he had uncovered something much larger than he ever expected. If you're still here and want to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below, so I know you're ready for the conclusion. Because the truth that came out next would change everything and decide what happens to everyone involved. Now, let's move on to the final outcome. Several months passed before the case finally reached its conclusion. Financial crime investigations move slowly, not because the evidence is unclear, but because every document must be examined with care. Each record becomes part of a chain that must remain unbroken from beginning to end. During those months, I stayed with Eleanor Hayes while the legal process unfolded. My furniture had already been recovered from the warehouse used by the moving company and returned to the house under police supervision. Still, the property itself remained under review while investigators completed their reports. When I finally stepped inside again, the rooms felt familiar and strange at the same time. The same sunlight moved through the tall windows facing Charleston Harbor. The same wooden floors carried the quiet echoes of years I had lived there. Yet the house no longer felt like the safe, unquestioned place it once had been. Something inside me had changed. The court proceedings began in early autumn. The courtroom itself was simple and quiet, nothing like the dramatic settings people imagine when they think about trials. Most of the work happened through documents, testimony, and careful explanation. Prosecutors presented the security footage taken from my house. The recordings showed Ryan Keller speaking with the locksmith, supervising the movers, and sitting at my desk while forging my signature on the property transfer document. They also introduced the life insurance application that investigators discovered during the search of Ryan's financial records. The policy listed me as the insured individual and Olivia as the beneficiary. The signature was another attempted imitation of my handwriting. Financial records revealed the motive clearly. Ryan's failed cryptocurrency investments had left him buried beneath enormous debt. The prosecution argued that he had viewed my house as the solution. Olivia's role in the situation was addressed as well. She admitted that she helped Ryan remove the furniture, believing his explanation that I had approved the arrangements before leaving Charleston. Investigators confirmed that she had no involvement in the forged documents or the insurance application. Listening to her testimony was difficult. Eventually, the court reached its decision. Ryan Keller was found guilty of fraud-related offenses, including forgery and attempted property theft. He received a prison sentence along with significant financial penalties. There was no sense of victory when the verdict was read. Justice had been delivered, but something more personal had already been lost. A week later, I returned once again to the front door of my house. This time, when I placed the key in the lock, the mechanism turned easily. The door opened. For the first time in months, I stepped inside, knowing the house was truly mine again. Life returned to a quiet rhythm in the months after the trial ended. I moved back into my house overlooking Charleston Harbor, the same house that had stood at the center of everything that happened. The rooms were once again filled with furniture and familiar objects, though I chose not to bring back everything that had been removed. Some pieces felt too connected to the memory of what had taken place. Instead, I replaced them slowly with things that felt new. Rebuilding a life sometimes means allowing space for change. Most mornings I sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watch the harbor wake up. Fishing boats move quietly across the water, and the early sunlight spreads across the rooftops of the Battery District. The house feels peaceful again, but not in the same way it once did. Now the calm comes from awareness rather than assumption. Eleanor Hayes still visits often. Our friendship has grown stronger through everything that happened, the kind of bond that forms when people stand beside each other during difficult moments. Family, I have learned, is not always defined by blood. My relationship with Olivia remains complicated. We speak occasionally, carefully rebuilding something that resembles trust, though I know some wounds heal slowly. Forgiveness does not erase what happened, but it allows life to move forward. I have also begun volunteering with a local organization that helps older adults recognize financial exploitation. I teach small workshops about protecting property records, reviewing legal documents carefully, and trusting instincts when something feels wrong. Looking back, the moment that changed everything was simple. I returned home and discovered the locks had been changed. Ryan believed that meant he had already won. What he never understood was that experience, patience, and evidence are stronger than deception. The door closed behind me once, but it opened again. Quiet endings rarely arrive with celebration. More often, they come with reflection. When trust is broken, the damage reaches deeper than property or money. It touches the places where the memory, family, and identity live. Yet hardship can also reveal a quiet truth. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it appears in patience, in careful preparation, and in the decision to stand firm when something feels wrong. Life has a way of testing the foundations we believe will never move. But roots that grow through experience, wisdom, and resilience can withstand storms far stronger than deception or greed. Protecting what matters is not a sign of fear. It is a form of respect for the life that has been built over many years. Thank you for walking through this story to the very end. If it made you reflect on trust, strength, or the value of protecting yourself, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, consider following and subscribing so we can continue these conversations together.